Welcome to Conversations Pushing the Needle in Africa's journey towards sustainable growth. That is the fuel for one slot. I'm Felicity Ezewike. So you probably noticed that Russia has been making some big moves in Africa lately. While the interest is not new, the approach has become increasingly deliberate. With the adoption of its new foreign policy concept in March 2023, Russia has made Africa a priority, dedicating a separate section to the continent for the first time. The previous versions of the policy grouped North Africa with the Middle East and contained only a single paragraph, kept unchanged over time, about Sub-Saharan Africa. So, understandably, there is very little argument when political watchers say this move signals a significant expansion of Russia's influence in Africa, with potential consequences for the continent's stability, security, and sustainable growth. In what were the Russian president's first international talks this year, 2025? Vladimir Putin met with the president of Central African Republic in Moscow. CNN reports this as a sign of the importance of Russia, the importance that Russia places in its relationship with Africa. But what is really driving Russia's sudden interest in Africa? Is it purely economic, or is there a larger geopolitical strategy at play? How will this courtship, so to speak, impact Africa's relationship with other Western powers? And what happens, and what does it mean, rather, for the global balance of power? To help with some answers, I have three guests, but we have two joining us now. The Dean, Faculty of Arts, Management and Social Sciences, Koladaisi University, Jen-Dele Hungbo. And we also have international media and political risk consultant who will be joining us a little later. But with us now is Africa Affairs analyst Stanley Fongod. Thank you, gentlemen, for giving us your time.
Thank you so much, Felicity, for having me.
All right, let me start with you, Mr. Hungbo. This courtship, what's your general view of this effort by Russia to integrate itself with African leaders? Mr. Hungbo, if you can hear me. Mr. Hungbo, can you hear me? Okay, Stanley, if you can take that on. Mr. Fongod.
All right. Yeah, I think that it's so much about what Africa is looking for rather than what Russia is actually trying to do on the African continent. I think that every developed nations have always looked at the African continent to become a breadbasket for them, especially when it comes to natural resources. So Africa just it's in an opportune moment as it is, especially with the growing sentiments on the continent of Africa against the West. And so Russia is finding just new opportunities on the African continent. I think it's fair for us to understand that the Russian influence on the African continent has always been in good times, especially if you look at the southern part of the continent, especially during the apartheid regime. Now, Russia is expanding that influence, especially around the areas of the Francophone African countries, where you have, which has been dominated by the colonial legacy of the Francophonie, influence on the continent. Now, Russia is finding that there is growing sentiments in those countries, especially in the French African nations, against the West, primarily France. And so Russia is just taking those opportunities to do what Russia would do, basically influence, and have this geopolitical influence in this part of in these areas on the continent of Africa. If you look at, you just reported places like Bangui, Central African Republic, which basically is understanding as a result of the Wagner Group. So we have to be able to basically see this not just from what Russia is trying trying to do, but as a way of looking at what Africa in itself is trying to gain, moving away from the West and moving east. There's a shift absolutely on the continent of Africa, especially within the Francophone nations. They are literally moving away from the east, from France, and looking at from the West and looking at anything else that they can find so far as the Eastern Bloc is concerned.
Interesting. I will take you off on that from another angle, but let's get the opening statement of the other guest. I understand we now have Tham-San-Qua Zhou. I hope I got your name correctly. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and good evening and good afternoon to your listeners as well.
Yes, it's good evening here in Lagos. We're glad to have you. Let's get your opening thoughts on the subject matter and Russia's courtship. Stanley seems to think it's more of what Africa wants in the relationship.
I think we have to take it down to the basics. The basics are that as a sovereign nation, or every sovereign region, in a way, has to look after its interest, the interest of its citizens and what is good for it. And then you stretch that to finding diplomatic relations that help you pursue those particular interests. So in this particular case, we look at Africa. There has been a power imbalance, probably since independence in the 1960s for most countries. The West has had an upper hand, and because it has had influence in terms of what administrations Africa has had. So most of those leaders would have been educated in the West, and they were pursuing, a different kind of ideology because of the Cold War. So the relationship with the Soviet Union then and Russia in particular now has been over the years shaped by that historical fact that there were always these tensions that the West was pulling because the regional interest lay in making sure that Africa aligned with the West during the Cold War. But post that and now, we see a different relationship. So we see in the Sahel, in the main, a lot of these countries trying to associate with Russia, or at least allow Russia to have a role, whilst balancing the relationship that they already have economically with the West. So I think you have to consider both and say Africa is now in a position where the African countries can negotiate what relationship they want with Russia, but also maintaining a relationship of sorts with the West without, the big hoo-ha that used to happen during the times of the Cold War. Back to you.
Okay, please, I don't want to forget, when I come back to you, Tham-San-Qua, I would want you to expand a little on where Africa is at with negotiating its relationship with Russia. Do we really have what it takes to be doing that? But I want to bring in Jen-Dele Hungbo. If you can hear me, can you acknowledge? Jen-Dele, can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, I didn't get your question, but I can hear you now.
Fantastic. So I don't know if you heard the other submission by Tham-San-Qua and Stanley, but basically we're trying to set up the basis for this conversation, and I think they've been able to put that on the ground. But I've asked Tham-San-Qua to think about the relationship with Africa negotiating the kind of relationship it wants. Do you believe that that is what is happening with Russia?
Well, I think it will be quite difficult to think that Africa is in such a situation where it can call the shots or where it can actually dictate what it wants. I think it's a matter of necessity that is pushing some of these African countries to tilt towards Russia at the moment. If you look at historical antecedents, coming from pre-independence up to independence, also up to the Cold War, Africa, the battles of the Cold War. And so I think in a multipolar world order, it's what's probably pushing some of these African countries to want to move towards seeking some form of leverage with Russia. If you look at what the West holds and what the United States promises in terms of, okay, yeah, we have a free market, we want democracy in all over the world. We are policemen of democracy and stuff like that. How much of this can we say continues to serve the interests of the people of these African countries? And I think on reflection, when you look at Russia's role, for instance, in BRICS, where there's an alliance with Brazil, with South Africa, with China, you will see that there are new centers of power evolving. And so some of these African countries, particularly South Africa, feels that it could play a very prominent role by associating with Russia or in a group, by playing a role in Africa in a group where Russia is a dominant power. But having said that, we need to consider the fact that when you look at the resources of Africa, the resources are there, but the exploration of the resources, the expertise, the infrastructure to turn these resources.
All right, Stanley, Jen-Dele, we'll come back to you. Your connection isn't very clear. I'll just jump on to Stanley. Just right off what Jen-Dele is talking about, like Africa has a lot of resources, but the exploration of these resources seem to be a weakness rather. Earlier, you said something about a pulling away from the West. Is there a connection between, maximizing what our resources are and the pulling away from the West? And what is in it for Africa with its courtship and romance with Russia?
Well, that question is quite loaded, and I think that it's just a buffet of things. But the reality is that you have to look at this from two standpoints. Number one, the Human Development Index and the Gross Domestic Product, which is basically GDP. And the reason for that is because if you look at what the West has done on the African continent, the West has been very instrumental in trying to be able to give us loans that are condition-based, and all of that gets towards pushing for a higher GDP. And in most cases, the Human Development Index has really not been there. The Human Development Index actually measures how people feel, or, it's basically life expectancy, whether people are living above the poverty line. And if you look at just the GDP alone, the GDP of a particular country might be very good, but the people in the country are actually suffering. And just because the gross domestic product looks great does not mean that the Human Development Index is good. That means if you look at what the West has done on the continent of Africa, because the West has come to Africa with this expectancy of extracting raw materials, that has somewhat improved on the GDP. But if you look at the HDI, the Human Development Index, that has really not done much. So the sentiment of the people has not improved at all. On the areas of raw material, what has happened is you have a lot of extraction of raw materials on the continent of Africa, and there is absolutely zero conversion, not even with gold. I mean, there's nothing else for you to do with gold than just to have a refinery and burn the stuff up. Not too much of any expertise is actually needed in that space, but we just export everything overseas. What that means is a lot of young people who are supposed to be employed in these particular sectors or industries are not being employed. A lot of people go jobless, but meanwhile, we are looking at a lot of progress so far as our GDP is concerned. That means the number of goods and services within a particular country seems to be going up, but if you look at it closely, it's only in particular sectors. And meanwhile, the Human Development Index always seems to tank. So the sentiment of the people now says we're going to look at some, we're going to look east, because if we look at what east does, East is actually giving out a lot of loans, but these loans are actually meant for state-owned projects, which is basically goes towards the Marxist idea, or the communist idea, which is not more free market. And so they're pushing this particular agenda, which in more ways will work, especially if you're asking the person on the streets of Africa, what has anybody done for me? They look towards the government, but meanwhile, the government really do not have the capacity for job creation. And the reason is because you need entrepreneurs. You need to be able to grow small to medium-sized enterprises. And there's this dynamics where we have to begin to find ways in which we can be able to utilize what the government has the capacity to do, especially building infrastructures that will support and grow the local economy, and also trying to find ways in which we can be able to grow the local economy by bringing a lot of innovation so that small to medium-sized enterprises can flourish, because those are the guys who actually generate wealth and create new industries. But the government has to be able to set the precedents as to this is what we want, this is where we're going, and these are the policies that we want to be able to ignite. This is how we're going to allow for free trade. This is how we're going to allow, for those who wants to start businesses, and also allow foreign direct investors to be able to come in and be able to set things up. But unfortunately, I think that there has to be that dynamics, which is what the continent seems to be grappling with. It's not just looking to the east, it's not just looking to the west. I think that we have to focus within.
Tham-San-Qua, I will come to you, please. But let me just echo back to Jen-Dele, and just I had to interject to manage time. Our network was acting up. Let's have you were saying something. I interrupted you, and then I want you to add to that your response to Stanley's position on the explanation on the reasons why Africans are pulling away from the West and what that means.
I think if you, like I was saying, if you look at and that thought seems to have been completed by Stanley when he talks about the extraction, the volume of extraction of mineral resources going on in Africa. But again, I think we need to look in the direction of the question of expertise for setting up manufacturing plants, for instance, to convert these raw materials into value, to add value to this, and then produce value that can create further employment for people for the young population in Africa, and also get the economies off the ground. If you look, but beyond that, beyond the economic consideration, we need to also look at questions around diplomatic maneuverings, and also the idea of having some form of global power behind you as a country on the African continent, such that you're not alone. You're not fighting a battle all alone, because the democracy that the West seems to have anchored its relations with Africa on, the demand for democracy. You need to democratize. You need to do this. You need to do that. Has it really come with enough value or enough protection for the people themselves? Because beyond one of the ways by which you can preach democracy to anyone is to let that person see that there is a positive change in his or her life as a result of being under a democratic dispensation. But where that does not happen, it becomes quite difficult to want to drag people away from forces like China, from forces like Russia, simply because you want to say, no, these are not democratic nations enough, or this country would allow for democracy to thrive, and so on and so forth. And so those hindrances of the rhetorics of anti-democracy, the rhetorics of anti-democracy no longer sell to most of these countries in Africa now. And so they're beginning to do self-introspection and reevaluate their own positions or subject positions in the global order.
All right, Tham-San-Qua, I am back to you with the same question I left you with, the negotiating of the kind of relationship that we want, Africans want with Russia. But into that mix, I want to add some of, I hope I get it right, I want to add some of the things that Stanley said. He talked about, I sense what he was saying was that we have resources. The exploration of these resources is where some of this relationship is at. So is it enough that we have these resources? Is it enough pedestal for negotiating the kind of relationship that we want with Russia, for instance?
Well, that is how it works. And I want to try and simplify it for your viewers.
Please do.
Africa, and I will try maybe to differ a little bit with my brother Jen-Dele. You know, Africa has strength. Whenever you go into these diplomatic negotiations, or when you formulate or establish or even maintain or amend or maybe change the diplomatic relations, you appeal to your strengths. What you want to shine are your strengths. So Africa has so many strengths. To begin with, when you talk about Africa as a whole, or even when you talk about Nigeria, the population, the consumption, the capacity to consume anything that comes from the nation that you are trying to have a relationship with is huge. You look at the youth, the dividend that you get from just saying that most of the people in Africa are young people. So whether you're talking about Japan, which is a country that is going to need a lot of workers or people to, because most of the people there will be old, their birth rate is not that good. They need a lot of people probably from Africa. So when you look at Russia, what does the Russian state want in the relationship with Africa? So for them, it is about political influence. When you do a risk assessment, you find that they want to try and starve off the economic oxygen from the competitor for them, who are the West. So they want to make sure that when Africa has a relationship with the West, it is not based on the West having access to the minerals or other wealth, maybe even crop or land, that will feed and grow the economies in the West. Because when the economies in the West are big and healthy, then the West is able to fund things like the war in Ukraine, for instance, or whatever else that they can do. So for the Russians, it will be important that maybe the Americans don't have access to the oil in Africa, or maybe France does not have access to the uranium in Africa. Why? Because then that affects the economies in the West and their capacity to then fund the military aspect, or maybe NATO, that will then be competing with Russia for this tussle for power. So you have to look at these things in minute detail. What does Russia want? What can the Africans leverage on that? So Africa can still have the relationship with the West based on particular and specific interest, but also have this relationship that is security-based with Russia. Or I can stretch it further, have a relationship with China even that is based on infrastructure, because the Chinese will come in, they will say to Nigeria, they can do the infrastructure that Nigeria needs, whether it is power or roads or railways.
Okay.
But it is because the Chinese want to be able to use that infrastructure for the things they want to do in Africa or in Nigeria. The West have always used the fact that there are historical ties. They will have access to mines for this, but only based on maybe charity. They will tell you that they've got NGOs that are looking after villagers and all. But the Russians want to give military support, which is what they do, Central African Republic, in the Sahel, and other places. So it's a different relationship. It is not as black and white as that. But I want to encourage my brothers both Stanley and Jen-Dele, that Africa has a lot to offer at the table. You don't go and negotiate a relationship with these former superpowers, or in the case of America, a superpower, when you're not in a position of power. You take a copy even of what President Trump does. You will put tariffs on Canada and Mexico and the EU and everybody. You will withdraw the Americans from the WHO and everything.
Okay.
Why? Because he wants to be in a position of power, and that's what Africa needs to do if it has to win negotiations.
Yeah, Tham-San-Qua, you really encapsulated some of the thoughts that I've had in crafting some of the question, and beyond the exploration, I don't know, the argument that Russia's involvement with Africa fits into this broader strategy to challenge Western dominance. But whether it is to promote a more multi-polar society is a different ballgame entirely. Let's go on a short break, and when we come back, we continue to explore this relationship and what is in it for Africa, or rather, how we should be putting, what we should be putting forward. Glad you're still here. We're looking at Africa's delicate balancing act, navigating ties with Russia and the West. I still have my guests with me, Jen-Dele Hungbo. He's been speaking on the subject as well, Tham-San-Qua Zhou and Stanley Fongod. Let's come to you, Jen-Dele. I'm kind of curious. We've talked about the resources that Africa has, but an aspect we haven't looked at is the fragile nature of governance that is in some of these states. The Central African Republic, for instance, we know what the situation is like there, and we know that one of the first international diplomacy acts of the Russian president was to have a meeting in Moscow with the president of CAR. So I want your thoughts as to the implication, not just for a democracy, but the broader strategic goal of Russia with this continuous military relationship. Okay, if Jen-Dele is not there, I think I'll throw that question to Stanley, since we just had Tham-San-Qua speak.
Yeah, look, excuse me. I think that there has to be just great concerted effort among Africans to be able to help, especially when it comes to the issues we face on the continent of Africa. And I think that we have to legitimately start looking within ourselves for the help that we need. For some strange reason, the African has been taught that looking to the West or looking to the East is where the salvation of the continent lies. It's a lie. The salvation of the African continent is not offshore, it's onshore. It's within Africans, it's within us, it's among us. I think that there is this famous expression made by Barack Hussein Obama, who he borrowed from a novelist, and it was that the people we have been waiting for, the person you have been waiting for, it's you. You are the one you have been waiting for. And the reality is that for the African and for us to emerge out of where we are, we have to look from within. The situations that we face on the continent, especially if you're asking about Central African Republic, every single thing falls and rises and falls on the issues of mining. And it is this cursed commodity that has thrown the entire continent into the country that we find. If you look at places like Goma in Central African Republic, if you look at places like Kogi in Nigeria, places like Riverside, where lithium is being mined, Ekiti, where lithium is being mined, you see the aggressive form of lithium that is being mined. Meanwhile, the West is celebrating the whole entire Green New Deal, where America wants to basically go green. But we go green in the West at the expense, of third world nations like DRC, like Cameroon, like Ghana, like Nigeria. We have this aggressive level of mining, and the blame does not just go out to the West. We also have to look at what the Chinese are doing on the continent of Africa so far as, mining is concerned. Most of our rivers have become, inhabitable ponds for many organisms, because they are just being poisoned. The water system is basically being poisoned at its root, and all of that because we are in pursuit, of liquid gold. We're in pursuit of lithium. We're in pursuit of gold. We're in pursuit of cobalt, and at the expense of the same people who live in those environments. Little do we forget that once the mining stops, we have to use the land for agriculture or something else. But the reality is, we have to be able to create a concerted effort, set up some kind of, an organization on the African continent that basically governs us. And the idea of having, my co-panelist was talking about having some kind of, basically enshrining ourselves in democracy. The question I ask is this: what good is democracy if the person on the street is hungry? What good is democracy if the democracy in itself basically pushes the agenda?
If I may interject, how is it that African leaders are blind to the transient nature of some of these minerals that are being explored in their country? I mean, from what you're saying, there seems to be some kind of challenge when we talk about the military coming in. I mean, the Russian military coming in, some sort of challenge for traditional notions of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Is it that our leaders cannot read between the lines, or they're hoping, like Tham-San-Qua said earlier, that they've defined the relationship enough to be able to walk away unscathed?
The reality is that if you look at most of our African leaders, they behave like radios. The unfortunate thing is that these radios, they don't have any dials on them. They have been preset to a particular channel so that the moment they come on, they dance to the tune of whichever channel, that they have been preset to. Most of our leaders are preset to channels in the West. So they have been, most of them educated in the West, have this Western ideology, have this Western philosophy. And in the end, what happens is the will of the people and the will to the countries that they have been elected to lead doesn't matter. They basically do whatever the beatings of the West is. And that's exactly what's happening to us on the continent of Africa, because I have no idea why you can have a leader who is in a particular country who is far more conscious about what Washington, D.C. says, who is far more conscious about what Paris says or London, rather than what is it that is happening to the people that he has been called to govern. And I think that the moment we begin to have Africans, leaders on the African continent who are conscious, Pan-African, who are conscious in the African agenda to those on the continent and those who are in the diaspora, that the African ideal needs to be espoused irrespective of whatever anybody says outside of the continent. I think that's how we solve these issues. Unfortunately, we have leaders who are not looking within, they are only looking without. The people on the continent and in these individual nations are those who are legitimately suffering. We can, just like I said earlier on, we can improve on our GDP as long as the elites are those who are in control, but meanwhile the Human Development Index is suffering.
All right, Stanley, let's go to Tham-San-Qua and get his thoughts on this. I mean, we have very limited time, so I need to move on to other areas. Talk to us about the potential consequences. Stanley has inferred a bit, but I want you to expand that, to talk to us about the consequences of this expanding presence in Africa, especially for our relationship with other global powers such as China and the US.
I think there are many areas. One is that the relationship that Africa has with the former Soviet Union area. Some of them are now members of NATO, but with Russia in particular, it can strengthen Africa in terms of being able to leverage and being independent of the Western influence when it comes to international institutions like the United Nations. Most of them, I think, post the Second World War, are linked to the UN system. So whether you're talking about the World Bank, the IMF, the WHO, any of those agencies, because what it does is when it comes to votes or when it comes to deploying personnel at those bodies, maybe one day you could have an African, maybe additional somebody being the head of the World Bank, rather than it continuously being somebody from the US. So you get that balance, that leverage, that opportunity for your vote to matter, because sometimes this vote, the African vote, is taken for granted. The second is that independence gives the impression to the West that the West will need to negotiate at a higher level or higher value, especially what these countries like Mali and Guinea and Burkina Faso have done. They have shown France that they are not going to allow France probably to be getting resources from them on the cheap. So they then can say, we don't need you in security terms because Russia is going to cover our back. But they can also say to Moscow, we will leverage on the support that we get from the West to be able to do those things. So I think it leaves Africa in a better position.
Okay.
I also want to question in general that these African leaders are trying their best. It's only that sometimes things are, put
stacked against them.
Capacity in Africa, especially when you look at the financial sector model that Nigeria and Nigerians have been able to do. Africans can do anything. Felicity?
Yeah. I said I was just trying to say it seems the stakes are against them, the odds are against them, no matter what they try to do. Jen-Dele, let me come to you. I can't remember if you're the one that alluded to this, but either you or Stanley, about soft power. I think it's Tham-San-Qua, soft power and cultural diplomacy, how Russia is using that in its approach to Africa. Is there some effectiveness here? And how is that actually shaping our perception of their presence?
I think when you look at Russia's approach, it's a combination of both soft power and some military insinuations. Because when you look at its cultural relevance, I think it's also about allowing African countries or African nations to express themselves towards Russia. Culturally, and then that is one of the things you see with the kind of collaborations that Russia sees with African countries at the moment.
Okay. I think the connection with Jen-Dele hasn't really been great so far in the conversation. So I'll just, Jen-Dele, if you can hear me, we'll just have to let you go. Thank you very much for speaking with us. Hopefully maybe we can have another time with you. Stanley, Russia's approach to conflict resolution in Africa, particularly in the Central African Republic, seem to differ from what you have from the West. What's your thinking? I think Jen-Dele was talking a bit about that as well.
Well, we have the conflict in Central African Republic. It's actually it's a major crisis for the region. And the reason is because you're looking at Islamic groups that is actually setting up some of the factions. Then we have the issues of militia groups that are surrounding a lot of mines. And the issue is most of the militia groups that are surrounding this, that basically, guides most of the mining expeditions that you have in Central African Republic, especially for diamonds. Most of these groups are actually being funded by foreign entities. So you have foreign organizations that is somewhat not affiliated with any major government funding these militias to get their mines so that they can be able to export whatever stuff that they can get so far as the country is concerned. My problem is on the continent of Africa, we do not have any kind of a robust force that is able to go into these regions and basically just keep the peace. The reality is that the life of those who are living in these countries, either you're looking at the DRC or you're looking at Central African Republic, none of these people's lives are getting any better. A lot of people are being killed needlessly, and it's just gross incompetence, across the board. The reality is the blame, so far as I'm concerned, is on the Organization for African Unity. I think that the EU has to do a whole lot more by basically bringing an end to the madness that is taking place in the DRC or in Central African Republic. I don't want to talk about, the fact that we have UN workers anywhere on the African continent. I think that the history we have had with UN, a peacekeeping force on the continent has been shameful. Even when we have had an African, like Kofi Annan leading the United Nations, we've had the worst atrocity committed on the African continent when an African, was on seat. So we have to be able to look within us, with us, for us, with an Afrocentric perspective, and inspire change on the continent of Africa.
I get quite passionate when I listen to folks like you speak passionately as well about how we need to look within. At the heart of all our challenges is leadership, the strength of leadership that we have. But that's a conversation for another day. Tham-San-Qua, how might Africa's relation with Russia evolve in the coming years, particularly when you consider all the shifting global dynamics and, of course, our own priorities?
I think we have to be very careful that we should not, although Africa is one, 54 or 55 countries, whichever way you look at it, at the moment, the way Africa is structured is such that it's better to talk about regional blocks. So what kind of relationship does ECOWAS have with Russia? It will be easier to analyze the ECOWAS interests. And probably, given that now there's in West Africa, there's kind of a public sentiment that speaks to the anti-neo-colonial view, thinking that maybe the West has not been the best of partners for the last 60 years or so. So it is easier for Moscow, probably in those communities, to have some impact because people just want something that is different. So you find that Burkina Faso, Traoré in Mali, in Goita and others in the region, their approach to politics going back to the Thomas Sankara days and their approach probably with or relationship with Moscow appeals to the youth in that region. If you look at East Africa, there's a lot of conflict in those areas. It is you mainly talk about maritime. You talk about where their interests are, which are mostly about infrastructure, not so much about the security that comes from outside. So the relationship would be different. The SADC, which is the Southern African area, it is mainly economic because the communities there are so westernized. So you find that in South Africa or Zimbabwe or Botswana or Namibia, the Russians are not likely to offer any military assistance. They're likely to probably offer a partnership in mining and industry. And then the north and the central, almost every region is different. So it is not that easy to see how that leadership can be done at a global level. Maybe now there's an opportunity because South Africa is going to be chairing the G20. Maybe there can be influence that can be put there and that leverage and the relationship with Moscow. I know that the finance ministers, for instance, at AU level, one body, so they can be looking at, with the assistance of the Africa Development Bank, what are the things that are in the interest of African nations, then they can push for that whenever there are these negotiations. I think you are right when you talk about African leadership, maybe there's need for a platform or maybe a template of what can be negotiated across the interests of most African countries that will benefit them and the governments and their communities and populations. I think if it is done that way, there could be leverage, because 1.3 billion people negotiating, you've got more power than probably, I don't know, Cape Verde trying to negotiate on its own. Nigeria probably has an advantage because of the population, but Nigeria also doesn't want to leave everyone behind.
True.
And just grab any or all these goodies that come from this relationship.
That will compound the leadership wars we're talking about, because like it or not, Nigeria does hold some responsibility towards the work to reimagine Africa for all of us. Talking of reimagining, just something off Tham-San-Qua's comments, regional bodies. Let me read it how I wrote it: reimagining, reshaping our regional bodies to be more effective in championing African priority. Tham-San-Qua said Africa is large, so perhaps we should, take it in bits. Stanley, what's your thoughts on that?
I think that's good, especially from the economic front. Reasons being, if we can go region by region, then open up our borders within those particular regions for free trade, so that we can allow goods and services to be able to move freely, among those countries in, for example, the ECOWAS region. That would be great. If we are talking about region by region, especially if we are thinking about having a currency, and then we have regional currencies, so that eventually we can have a super currency on the continent of Africa, so that we can basically settle our debts with that particular currency without being influenced left and right with something like the CFA franc or the dollar. That will be great. But when you start talking about region by region, it still boils down to the same thing, especially when it comes to security and having this harmony across the region. It has to do with the fact that we need Pan-Africans. If you look at ECOWAS, for example, recently the boys in the Sahel began this series of coups, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and all of that basically got, especially when it got to Niger. Niger was basically the boiling point because of the Trans-Sahara pipeline from Nigeria, which those guys basically said it was not going to happen. Now, that created this conflict within the Western Bloc, and what ECOWAS basically told us in plain sight was that the West still has a lot of influence, even within the regions, that the Western world can be able to influence men like Tinubu in Nigeria and the former president of Ghana to be able to, to say, you know what, we're going to bring sanctions and God knows what. But meanwhile, the reality is, if it was just a more concerted effort on a Pan-African front within the region, that will have made tremendous sense. I have no problems with region by region conversation, as long as those regions by region conversation is laced with a Pan-African agenda from an Afrocentric perspective, men who speaks the language of the continent, who speaks to the soul of the continent, or rather than to the souls of men who are outside of the continent. I think that Africans really need to be in charge, no matter how small, just within the Western Bloc. I think that makes tremendous sense. In that, I'm good with my brother on that.
Tham-San-Qua, how can Africa be more in charge, aside from strengthening the regional bodies? In what ways can we, assert ourselves more so that the power dynamics, it's not against us?
I think it is the belief system. And I actually see what is happening in West Africa with the likes of Traore and Koité and others, just as a way of reminding African youth that the power is with them and they can do anything they want to do. So most of that is the propaganda narrative that speaks to inspiring Africans to believe in themselves. I gave the example of Nigeria's financial sector earlier. Most of those are people that, without looking at the late Wigwe and maybe people like Jimovia and others, most of the people that are working or are working in the financial sector in Nigeria, are people that went to America, the Wall Street, they were working for these top banks, and they came back home. And they decided to start things that most people didn't think were possible. You look right across Africa, there are many Africans that are running these particular institutions of excellence, whether in the West or in the East. So these people can come back home. So Africa has that potential, has that capacity. All you need is to be able to give them the support to put everything together. I'm confident that Africans can do this, can deliver. We saw that in the Arab world, most of those places like Dubai and Saudi Arabia, they basically took charge of their own resources, and now they are bigger than they were before. Where I might differ slightly with Stanley, or maybe persuade him to be, more positive, is you don't have to be stuck on the Pan-Africanism can be defined differently. You can still be a Pan-Africanist but come up with a totally different model. That's what the Chinese have done. Because after Mao Zedong, the Chinese realized that they could copy and paste the Western capitalist system into their own traditional communist system, and that has worked for them.
Tham-San-Qua, I have to interject. This conversation has been more amazing than I thought it would be, and that's thanks to your contributions. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for giving us your time. Stanley, it's been a pleasure as well talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Earlier, we had the Dean, Faculty of Arts, Management and Social Sciences, Koladaisi University, Jen-Dele Hungbo. We had to let him go because of a bad connection, but I'm hoping to have another conversation with him in the future. That's our talk today. At the heart of most of our challenges is leadership, the will to take the bull by the horn, take the risks that are needed. But outside of leadership, what about followership? Do we have that? Well, we shall see in the coming years. Thanks always for being here on News Central. More programming coming your way. I'm Felicity Ezewike.